All right, today we'll start talking about social class stratification, and this will be followed up, just as an FYI, with two other dimensions of stratification that we'll look at next time in the coming weeks, actually. Racial and ethnic stratification, and then sex and gender inequality. So whenever we are talking generally about stratification, the idea, even just the connotation of the term stratification, sort of implies that there's different layers, and that's just the layering of people in terms of their rank in society, based on multiple dimensions, whether that's your income or your wealth or the property you own or the power you have, just the influence you have in the world, or the prestige, kind of the honor that you have. Sometimes those things are coupled together, as we'll see, but sometimes they're not. When we think about stratification in the US, we typically think that there are four social classes: the elite, the middle class, the working class, and poverty. So read your book for more of those details, but generally that's how in the US we conceptualize social class. So there's been a lot of, as you can imagine, discussion of why stratification exists and a lot of theoretical assumptions on why stratification exists. So I'll go through this real quickly because your book does a thorough job of explaining each of these perspectives. Davis and Moore's perspective, their theory, which aligns with this functionalist perspective. I think two of the key ideas from their thoughts is that not functionalism, but stratification exists because there's certain positions that I think we'd all agree that are important and critical to our society, and we want those positions to be filled by the best, brightest, smartest, most capable people as possible. Especially whenever we think about people in leadership positions or people that are, literally going to be, taking care of our health and performing surgery on us. Like, we absolutely want people that are the most qualified in those particular positions. So Davis and Moore suggests that to motivate people in those positions, we need to offer them greater rewards. And typically in terms of their salaries and their prestige as well, just the honor we bestow them. So one of the critiques of this, and this is the simplified version, but one of the critiques of this idea is that if stratification worked in this way, we would be a true meritocracy. And what we tend to see when we look at intergenerational studies of social class outcomes is that overwhelmingly, unfortunately, wherever we end up or wherever we begin in life is oftentimes where we end up. So overwhelmingly, people who start off in the elite or born into elite families are going to end up in those elite positions when they age into adult, their adult time spans. And conversely, if we look at people that are born in working class or even, of course, in poverty, they tend to end up in those same positions once they reach adulthood as well. One other quick example that kind of disrupts this functionalist idea of stratification is that we would tend to think that college enrollment is based on ability, and we like to think about that, and we like to imagine that that's the case. But whenever we look at who actually goes to college, and especially who's more likely to graduate from college, the best predictor of that is family income. There's been numerous studies where they've statistically thrown in a lot of variables, your GPA in high school, the number of AP courses that you've taken, in addition to other issues like your family income and, the type of high school that you went to and so on and so forth. And what we see is that, the single best predictor is how much money your parents make. That matters almost more than anything else in terms of college enrollment and, like I said, especially college graduation. So that is showing that there is this inequality that's built into the system. If it's more likely, based on your parents' bank account, for certain individuals to attend college more than others, that does show that it's not entirely a level playing field. And then in contrast to that, of course, we have Marx, which is the conflict view of stratification. So this is almost the complete, as you can expect, the complete antithesis of functionalism and the functionalist perspective of stratification. So Marx imagined that there are scarce resources and there's a lot of competition for those scarce resources, and that's really what's framing this conflict that's in play in our world, and that's really the impetus for these different social class divisions that we see in our world. So for Marx, he thinks that social class was based entirely on the economy. So just a real quick overview of Marx and capitalism, and just framing how he was setting the stage here. Capitalism, and I think it's important to remember this, but capitalism really refers to those social systems, those economic systems in which production is privately owned. It's not owned or really maintained by the governmental sector. That's the key dimension of what defines capitalism. Means of production that's all privately owned. It's private corporations that own those companies and those factories and those various means of production. So for Marx, as he was thinking about capitalism, again, this was in the late 1800s that he was doing a lot of his work, he made sense of our economic system, or his economic system, since he was European, as being divided into two different classes, essentially. So the first is the bourgeoisie, and this would be the capitalist class. So this is the ruling class. These are the individuals that own the means of production. They own the factories, and they own the machines and everything that helps with the economic functioning of the world. And then secondly, if you're not an owner of those means of production, the only thing that you have to really influence your labor power to get any sort of income generated is selling your labor power. And a lot of times it's physically your labor power. So the proletariat was the working class. Those were the factory workers, the people that were, again, just selling their labor power to the capitalists. So for Marx, and during his time, he saw that there were two and only two classes. So you're either an owner of those factories or those corporations or businesses, or you're a worker. There wasn't really any in between for him. I'll continue with this and then I'll follow up with a little addendum, I guess. So part of the conflict that's written in this system, according to Marx, is that workers can do very little to increase their pay or position. And a lot of times that's set by two things. So first off, the pace of the work, and the work itself is set by the bourgeoisie. So if someone else is telling you what to do, how to do your work, you're symbolically a cog in that machine. And probably the more substantive component of this is that work becomes de-skilled. So if you think about artisan times, there was a lot of skill that families had, and they passed down those skills from one generation to the next. So if you were a family of carpenters, there was a lot of work and a lot of skill and a lot of even pride, of course, that went into the work that you did. So if you could take slabs of wood and turn that into these nice, intricate, kind of tailor-made chairs and tables and whatever the case might be, that was valued work, and there was a good life that could be had from learning that work and building your livelihood off of that. So as we move into the capitalist structure, we see that factory systems made a lot of these products mass produced, and there's some benefit to that, but the cost is that it becomes de-skilled. So everything is interchangeable, and to work in a factory, you don't need to learn how to make a table from start to finish, but you might just be responsible for, screwing in one of the legs to the table or something like that. So there's not a lot of skill that's tied to that. And the rationale from the mind of the owners is that because this is de-skilled, I can literally bring anyone off the street to do this job and train them in under 5 minutes. There's not a lot of skill tied to this. And because of that, it's worth less. That job is worth less. And that's the inherent problem with some of these workers' positions is that it's de-skilled work, and so it's a de-skilled labor, and it's not as valued as it once was. And you can work as fast as you can, as much as you can, but if you're paid by the hour, that's not going to influence your position or your salary from one week to the next. So there's this exploitation that's inherent, according to Marx, in this system, and that, to him, that's the problem. So just as a quick addendum, Eric Olin Wright, who's mentioned in your book, talks about some of the limitations of Marx and how it's probably not reasonable for us today in 2020 to think about there being just the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, but there might be expanded social classes that we should think about. And he does talk about those. So I would look for that and pay attention to that. And then finally, we have, his name is Weber. It looks like Weber, but we use the German pronunciation just as an FYI. Weber's view of stratification. Says SI in parentheses that refers to symbolic interactionism. And just a quick overview of how he made sense of stratification. He was a peer. I think he was slightly younger than Marx, but part of his work was somewhat in response to Marx. And he generally believed that Marx had it right, that the economic system really is the fulcrum that determines your position in the social class system. But he thought that was a little too simplistic. There's other pieces that come into play in terms of your social class positioning. So for him, he thought there were three distinct components of stratification. So these are the three of them. There's different translations. Your book might refer to them in slightly different terms since he's a German sociologist and we're translating his work, of course. But generally wealth, prestige, and power. So wealth is your income, your property. That really does align with what Marx was talking about in terms of the bourgeoisie proletariat distinction. So where you fall in terms of your placement in that economic structure and system. So wealth, just kind of think about that as being aligned with what Marx was talking about. And Weber said, I think there's two other things going on here, and he added on prestige and power. So prestige refers to just that, here it says social honor, kind of that respect that you're granted for the work you do or the position that you're in. So if we think about physicians or other religious priests or religious leaders or even social activists, if we think about the MLKs of the world, there's a lot of prestige tied to the work that they do, and that can be a component of your influence. So important to think about that, not necessarily the economic component, but just the honor that's granted that position. And then there's power, so the influence or the control that you have over others. And power really is the ability to get people to do what they want to do, even when they don't want to do it. And clearly that's important in our world, in our social world, and in this larger world of stratification, or this outline of stratification. And that was the third dimension that Weber construed. So if you're in a powerful position, whether that's a leadership position in our government, in our federal government, or even local government, or if you're in an influential position in your organization, that's part of your social class identity, and that's part of this system of stratification. So all three of those components for Weber were important in terms of how he made sense of stratification. So three slightly different or very different perspectives of stratification. Bear all that in mind as you kind of move forward and think about these other issues. There's a discussion of the living room scale in your book. And part of that is really just talking about how class is culture. The way that we kind of live our social class identities isn't just tied to our paychecks, but it's tied to everything else bound up with that. So the things that we hold true, the norms that we attend to in our lifestyle. So if you think about leisure activities, what do you go to wine and cheese parties, or do you go to tractor trailer pulls? There's a different component of social class tied to how we engage in that, or the ways that we parent, or the products that we buy. So class really is embedded in all those everyday aspects of our lives.